First of all, welcome to my panelists. We're going to get quick introductions in a second. Just so that those of you watching can make sure that you are in the right place. We're talking about big data and analytics, and the topic is outcomes as a service. And just to put all the answers into context, I'll let my panelists introduce themselves very quickly. So, Stephen, if we just move in this direction.
So I'm Steve Callahan. I'm Vice President of Strategy globally for Energy and Utilities at IBM.
Hi, I'm Meri Braziel. I'm Managing Director for Europe, Middle East, and Africa for Trilliant.
Good afternoon. Russ Vanos. I'm Vice President of Sales and Marketing for Itron's Global Software Services and Smart Cities practice.
So, first of all, welcome. Thanks for making the time to be here, and thanks to our audience as well for being here and watching this thing. The idea behind big data and analytics, and as we were talking off air, you can go down two routes. You can go down the very grungy technical route, and you very quickly start talking about Hadoop, MapReduce, and big query, big table, big everything, NoSQL, and things like that. But that's not what we're going to do. And one of the things that I want to bring to life in this panel is what are the outcomes in the context of the energy sector that we can get out of the big data and the analytics. And if I may, Russ, can you just kick us off on that side, and we'll just go down the panel?
Sure, be happy to. So I think one of the disappointments of the AMI revolution, the smart grid revolution, is it promised huge customer benefits, and it created these smart meters who collected all kinds of data, and it delivered very little value in some regards. I was at a PUC conference in the United States last week. One of the regulators reported that a smart grid program in that state had cost $800 million, and it had delivered less than $100 million in benefits to the customer. So when we look at that problem from the Itron perspective, we say, you know, making use of that data goes way beyond just collecting it. So I think as an industry, we underperformed on that. We created and collected lots of data, and we handed that data to utilities, and we said, buried in that data is a leak, or buried in that data is somebody stealing from you, or, you know, there's some connectivity issue there. But you had to, as an industry, kind of sort through that data and find it. And first of all, you're probably underskilled to do that as an industry, and second of all, you probably don't have the people to do it. So when I think about outcomes as a service, it's really taking that AMI data for this discussion's about energy, but electric, gas, and water, and really moving to the next level, which is adding the true value, which is delivering to you a work order that says, at this address is, you know, this situation, and really delivering an outcome. Now, those aren't real sexy kinds of things, because when we think about big data as a service, we want to think about, you know, really sexy things. But I think that is where at least this industry needs to go next, is let's take the data that we created with AMI and smart meters, and let's deliver on the promise that we, you know, created originally about where we would go with that data.
So this is going beyond a one-dimensional use case and saying, okay, here are other outcomes or things that are of value to you, either operationally or from an intelligence perspective as well. Can I bring you in on that as well? I mean, can you just embellish on that?
Absolutely. I agree with you. There is more than enough data. It's how do we make it, you use the word intelligent, and turn it into something that can be used. I think an important point to realize, though, are the different audiences. You have the customer marketing team. They want to know usage profiles and how they can change behavior. Then you have back office operational systems, and they're looking at the same data, but from a different perspective. So I think it's important to realize who is your audience for the data and know the requirements going in. There are lots of tools, and as you said, there are people who can put together the outcomes, but you have to know what those outcomes are defined up front. What are you looking for? And I think that's one thing that we have seen that are starting to drive and ask just basic questions. It's not delving into the SQL databases and pulling out the information. It's saying, what are you trying to find? What are you trying to achieve? And do that hard work up front, more the thinking and the requirements, and then the outcomes follow. So we could have a lot of outcomes, but if you don't know what you're trying to find, it's going to be irrelevant. So that's what we've seen quite a bit of.
And Stephen, can I bring you in on there as well from IBM's perspective as well? Some interesting acquisitions that IBM have made. You bought the weather.com.
The weather company.
The weather company. That's right. And so there's weather data coming in. Can I ask you to maybe put another layer on this outcomes?
Yeah.
What are the new outcomes?
But I actually think about it in terms of classes of outcomes or types of outcomes. There's sort of generally globally three that people are going after. The first is what we would call descriptive, which is really a fancy name for reporting. And it's not to belittle it. I mean, a large amount of value can come out of just basically doing improved reporting, but descriptive analytics, descriptive outcomes. The other class is predictive or prospective analytics, and certainly the weather company doing weather forecasting, or even better linking that to asset records, that sort of thing, and actually predicting a damage footprint and being able to improve restoration is an example of that predictive landscape. And then the third one, which I think is really a result of, first of all, the hype cycle in this area is where I think we're at the top of the hype cycle, and we're actually now getting into providing real value. But it's more strategic, and to the point, a couple points you were making, the utilities that are most stressed from a competitive point of view, who are most interested in making the pivot to kind of this new energy, whatever that model looks like, and there'll probably be many models across the world, are using advanced analytics, looking for outcomes to change their business models, to change basically how they engage with customers, et cetera, et cetera. That's looking like the frontier of where the most advanced stuff is going on, which is not in the energy utility space, it's in the retail space, or it's in the banking space or the insurance space, where they really need to understand behaviors and understand how the human element, not just how the Kirchhoff's laws work, but how predictive analytics associated with human behavior work.
And just on that side then as well is, so it seems to me like you've got the business as it stands now, so theft, revenue assurance, all these outcomes can be delivered. And you mentioned the hype cycle, because there is this hype around big data. Everybody was running around big data, big data, big data. It's going to solve the world. Right?
Or no, it's usually so much data. So much data. And
overwhelming.
And there are other industries who've dealt with that amount of data. It's all contextual. But if we can then bring it back down to what you ended on, and let's work back up the couch in that way, is how are you seeing data and analytics help actually shape some of these new business models? It's a very general question, so you're within your rights to confine it within an area, because a bunch of other things need to be right, like regulation and so on, but let's not spend the time talking about that.
Well, if you kind of beam yourself into the world of 20 years ahead of us, the business is going to be wrapped around data. So, and again, I think you see particularly utilities who are most aggressive here are the ones that are already under some type of stress, whether it be real market stress or regulatory stress or whatnot that they have to react to, and so they recognize that that's true. You're certainly still going to deliver electrons as a commodity, but it's really going to be a data business. And you start to talk about the platforms, the new business platforms that are going to evolve. We think there's 5 of them. 4 of them are almost pure data plays, right, in one way or another, which is the customer side or the exchange, the balancing of energy sort of side. So you're going to have to embrace that type of technology and leverage it basically to survive in the world that is coming right on top of us.
So could you just build on that?
Absolutely, I agree. The fact that I don't see how organizations will know what's happening in their business without the data. It's almost they're flying, with completely blind. So I think businesses will just, and what we've seen actually, they delve in, they take a baby step, and they say, oh, that wasn't so hard, because the tools, there really are a lot of tools out there that can make it easy, just for any layman almost, to pick and choose and, you know, build their own.
The tools aren't the problem, right?
No, absolutely. They're there. But I think the point is somebody has to take that first step. They have to then look and say, here's what I want to discover more than anything else. Find it's relatively easy, and then they go more and more. And then it just becomes a way of life. You can't imagine not being able to ask those questions and get the information. So I do think it's about starting on a path, but you can't take all the data all the time and look for every minutia, you know. It is about finding and asking the first question.
And on that note of asking the first question, because it does seem to me that you know, some of the people who do the hyperbole behind big data is like, listen, you just have to do it. Don't ask any other questions. Just get yourself a data scientist, throw a load of numbers at them, and they'll find gold for you, right? It doesn't work that way in the real world.
And I think they need to understand the business and the drivers behind the business. You can't have somebody who's just theoretical.
Yeah.
But there is something to say about, and I agree that, you know, that extreme is an extreme, but there is something to say about creating an environment within the organizations that allow the organization to experiment to the point of, you know, they have all this data, they haven't done anything with it. I know specific examples where they've created that environment and let their, I'll call them data scientists, small d, in the organization go after it. And they've come up with things that they've actually now implemented in operations, which are basically, you know, improved operations. So you do have to understand what the first step is, but there's something to be said for kind of, you know, letting the creative process work, which is hard in many utilities, right? Utilities tend to be structured. Yeah. They don't like that.
And that first step in your mind is the step that gives you confidence to maybe then play a little bit differently.
That's right.
Russ, from your experience, you know, you guys have been at the coalface for a while.
Yeah.
Would you agree?
Yeah, well, I agree completely. I actually would say big data is the problem. I think, you know, you said it, data exists and technology exists. We need to figure out what is the problem we're trying to solve. And so you asked the question, you know, where is it where is it becoming reality? I think it's in markets where customers are seeing changing business models. So in California, for example, where you have all the renewables coming into play, that's putting real pressure on those utilities. Think about what's their business model of the future. You have those kinds of pressures throughout markets all over the world. They're not always renewables. They could be, I want a smart cities play. It could just be the changing dynamics of their market. And as they start to look at their business models, and if they think about technology and if they think about data, there's all kinds of opportunities to create new experiences for customers and maybe new business models for companies. And if I stop thinking about big data and start thinking about what kinds of marketing tools, what kinds of outcomes do I want for my customers, then I would turn to experts like IBM or Trilliant or Itron and say, you guys take care of that, because I don't think utilities or any one company, not even Itron, would be able to have enough data scientists with enough knowledge and domain expertise. Because to Meri's point, as I try to solve different things or have different outcomes I'm looking for, to know that data still is important. And we have domain experts around all kinds of neat things around energy and water, but if you start to apply some of the weather stuff you're talking about, we get lost. Or if you move into a real smart city play where maybe there's transportation or traffic, we get lost. So collaboration becomes a real big thing here too, right? And having lots of good industry partners. So I think big data is actually the problem. You gotta quit trying to think about what do I want to do with big data and start thinking about what do I want to do with my customers? How do I want to engage with them? And what do I want my business model to look like in the future?
And just on that point, and one of the things to the audience out here, if you have any questions, just raise your hand and my colleagues will try and get them to me in a very low-tech way. They'll pass me a piece of paper, right? But it works, right? So we're going to use it. Russ, I just want to build on that, and you said something in there which is being echoed. You know, you need a different breed of person to start looking at this data in an intelligent way. You know, and individually as maybe a small local utility or even a larger utility, holding on to some bright data scientists may not work. They'll probably run off to Google or Amazon or IBM or wherever, right? So is that another reason why, as an industry, we need to start offering these things as a service?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely one of the reasons. I hate to say it in this crowd because I don't know who all these folks are, but I bet the best data scientists in the world, I'll say, aren't going to go to work for Itron. They may not go to work for you guys. They probably will for IBM and others, right? And so I think your strategy shouldn't be about acquiring data scientists. It should be about how do I make use of analytics, how do I make use of software as a service to, again, obtain real unique outcomes so I can offer new experiences to customers and have new business models. So there's plenty of opportunity to find data scientists through third-party companies. I don't think you need to, you're going to create a whole department that's whole job is to hire, recruit, and manage a turnover of data scientists because they're not going to stay there. And that's the large utilities of the world. Think about the smaller, municipals or water companies. They're never going to be able to do that. You need companies like are sitting here.
And I've been quite linear in how I've been going up and down, so I'm going to just mix it up. I'll come to you. I'll come to you in a second as well, Stephen. If you listen to this as well, there are two issues that come to my mind. Some of it is about being able to ask the right first question. Sometimes you don't even know how to do that without having some background experience of, an understanding of what's potentially out there. So can I just get you to paint a picture of how you might get to that right first question?
Okay. And it actually is more or less a follow-on to the other question. And I won't call it a contrarian view, but maybe a modified view. I think you got to think in kind of strata. There's definitely a requirement for analytics outcomes as a service that would use these, what we would call really hardcore data scientists. Those companies are emerging, and I think they'll continue to be strong. But and I certainly understand the size of the utility problem. So I deal mostly with larger utilities, so maybe I'm biased, but there's a value to implementing in an organization, a utility organization, what I call wizardom. A very specific example, in the early days of all this, utility executives came and asked the question, should we take all of our data people and put them in IT? Should we centralize them? Should we leave them in the business, et cetera, et cetera? It was the predominant question. And I'm sure it still is, it comes up a lot, but we've kind of now answered it the same way, that you already have data scientists in utilities. I guarantee you every executive has their person, and he or she is probably about 4 levels down in the organization. And when they have to do something for the board or their boss, 7 o'clock at night, they pick up the phone. That person answers because they're still there plugging away, and they know this data set, right? And this data set was going to basically give the answer. So knowing the data is, to your point, being able to ask the question has a lot to do with basically knowing the data. And then creating an environment where that wizardom, those wizards, we call them data wizards, can exist in the organization. I'll just give you the fast forward to the bottom line. We argue now that you don't centralize them into an organization, that you give them structure, that you have a centralized organization that sets about data governance and structural definitions that promulgate so your data is basically workable, but that you leave them in the business because they're better off in the business, they're going to operate better in the business, but you create an internal network of them you just use social networking techniques and allow them to collaborate. And then that's when you see these cross-silo things pop up where the operations guy and the customer guy or gal basically says, what if we did this? And they get a new insight, they can start to create new outcomes. So I think fostering that internal channel, like maybe it's data scientists, small d, is actually pretty important to be able to answer, because they know, to ask the right question, because they know what the questions are because they're in the business.
Yeah, I think just tying into that, as you mentioned earlier, there are other industries who have gone down this path further and faster. So, for example, we took a person who'd been in telecoms, and they had looked at network performance. And so it was just about, teaching them, training them on utilities, but it was the same question. So they had that experience. I think there is, as you said, the small D, and they don't necessarily have to come out, have worked in utilities for all these years.
Some cases
and it is
better
going
than
across,
they
yeah,
have, right?
yeah. But it is important to have, you've got to have both sides of it.
Yeah,
I think you can't have just the data scientist who knows the data without understanding the whole industry. And as I said, it's the drivers. What is changing the business, and where is it headed?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So on that note, as we're kind of progressing in time and coming up to the end of the time that we've got, there's one more theme that I want to explore. So how do we deliver information that makes a difference? So I think we've kind of built up the narrative, and I'm paraphrasing your words. These are my words, so you're absolved from it. We're basically saying you've already got data and big data, you've got all that stuff. You need to start asking the right questions to deliver value out of it, and forget about issues about mining data. Just ask the questions, because those other ones can be solved. If the poet is. But where I'm going with this is, what is the information that we need to deliver that makes a difference? I was chairing a panel earlier on, and people were saying that the energy system is becoming so complex. I said it in my introduction. We're getting different actors. We're getting people from behind the meter. We're getting, Eneco have done this in the Netherlands. They've created a virtual power plant using Tesla Powerwalls, which are essentially in people's houses. To your point, that's effectively a data play. It's got some hardware in it and so on. But can I just Meri, can you just give us some insight into where you're seeing information, what actually makes a fundamental difference?
Absolutely. I think one of the things, and I've heard it over and over, of course, is the use of tariffs, obviously, to change behaviors. And this whole concept of time of day, and whether, somebody will be using, putting their washing on at 2 o'clock in the evening, which I thought that was a bit extreme. I could, see 10 o'clock in the evening, but somebody said 2. And really changing how the energy grids themselves and the flows. I think it's going to change quite dramatically just by giving people the power of information. I think it's back to that agnostic information they don't even know about.
Do we need different data sets for that? I mean, how? Because there is also a conversation about siloed data. There's data that I own as the customer.
That's right.
How do I play?
It is, and it's how you present it. It's also, it's not bits and bytes anymore. And this is where you see the growth of, consumer apps, where the apps tell you different things. And it is designed to say, where can we change behaviors by providing information? So I really think we're just at the beginning of the journey. People are actually starting to talk about, I saw what happened when I turned my kettle. It's like a light bulb's gone off. Wow. They see cause and effect. So it's one thing to say, yes, I'm X amount of kilowatts and I pay my bills, but I don't see by my behavior something else has changed. So I think that's where we're going to go, is those cause and effects that ripple down through the system.
What are you seeing on that?
So, and I agree with that. I think you can't really a priori know where all these data sets are. So the notion of being able to come up with some baseline data sets is probably a hard task. And so I don't mean to do a plug, but this is a good example where you would apply cognitive technology, where you have lots of different unstructured data, some structured data, and the way that they come together, you don't know a priori. You don't know it from a deterministic point of view. So it kind of back ends those sort of answers. That sort of technology, I think, will help, and it's emerging. I mean, the cognitive analytics space is kind of the next, it's after predictive and prescriptive. It's a cognitive-oriented space, but and opening the aperture to more than just utility data, because utilities are now interested in customer behavior. They are interested in how you use weather beyond just whether it's going to rain or not. You don't know exactly the questions you want to ask from the get-go.
Russ, can you just sort of maybe not build on that, but also one of the things that I found interesting that you guys are doing organizationally, where you've got almost a separate business unit called the Innovation Labs, and so that must be a big change, because a lot of that stuff is based on data as well, isn't it?
Yeah, perfect. I'm glad you asked that. I think it starts with the customer. It really does. Mary's hit on it a couple of times, so has Steve, but I think we really have to do a much better job of understanding what is it that they want, as opposed to what can I do with the data. We get, again, too hung up in the data. So we need more focus on the customer. What do they want? It means I think we have to bring them into all kinds of collaboration sessions. The other thing that we should do is, once we spend time understanding what the customer really wants, is we should innovate. And to me, innovation means, because I do believe that technology and data exist. We're going to have more and more technology, but our problem delivering real, true innovative experiences for our customers isn't lack of technology or data right now. It's really knowing what they want. And you said an important thing, Steve, about the little D and having all these little people who do understand the data across all these silos. I think that's important too. So I think you got to be able to innovate, which means it's not just inside the utility or inside the utility and their partner like an Itron or a Trilliant, but bring in multiple parties, multiple entities. So if we had IBM, Trilliant, Itron, utility, customer, and we were able to do innovation, and we have a department at Itron that's our Ideas Lab, which is there specifically to work on these kinds of problems with utilities. IBM has similar kinds of things, and we work really quickly to come out and produce, here's what we thought you were asking for, how does this work, Mr. End Consumer, not utility customer, but Mr. End Consumer. And most of the time it comes back with, well, that's not exactly what I had in mind. And so you have to be able to have very agile development, turn things a couple of times. You can't do it with every customer, right? You got to pick where you're going to go do this stuff. But innovation, I think, is real key to all this. Collaboration, getting lots of participants. Now, that's a nightmare to manage to some degree, but if you can find a way to do that, I think you really open up the breadth of the outcome, and you enrich the outcome tremendously.
And just to wrap us off, because I'm conscious of everybody's time, and very, very, very quickly, can I just ask each of you, what's the most surprising outcome that you guys have had to deliver on as a business? And it can be a very simple one, but I just want to give the audience an idea of where people are coming from and what they're thinking of. And you can also take the fifth on this one.
Surprising.
Yeah, it is surprising. Just a simple one. We had a situation where one of the retailers was curious because something was happening specifically in a region, but they couldn't see it. They needed to be able to visualize the data as to why they weren't getting certain information. And it turned out to be a basic, a cell was down for a mobile operator. But they kept going,
so
looking at things. It was that simple,
yeah.
But then they knew how to go and solve it. Right. Whereas they were seeing bits, but until they were able to visualize and see, people were ringing them, but they hadn't put it all together that there was a certain region. And once you could visually see the data as well, and as I said, then they could take an action, as opposed to just responding to one call at a time.
So this is down to how you present the data.
That's true.
The visual piece.
The visual makes a big difference.
Makes a
more
big
powerful
difference, and so on.
So mine would be the connectivity model, a little more geeky, I guess, than that one. But it turns out many utilities have no clue what phase their meter is on, and it's actually a very serious problem. So with a couple of utilities already, we've created analytics that basically induces the phase from the various readings in the network. And I think it's over 92% effective. So, you know, an example of a point problem, but a very painful point problem that makes a big difference in operations.
Well, I was going to
the
say,
same one?
I was going to say connectivity.
Glad I went first.
but I think it's interesting that the biggest demand we get right now is around storm restoration, which is all about connectivity. And you would think that everybody knows that, and it turns out we really don't. So, but that's a good example of what's the problem. Is like, how do I know how to, operate in storm restoration? They didn't say I have all this data. What do I do with it?
Exactly, but it boils back down to
asking the right question.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you as well in the crowd for watching this energy talk. There are many more energy talks on Engerati.com, and if we've done our job right, we've probably added a few more links so that you can explore some of these topics a little bit more. Thank you again for watching, and thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.